Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who rewrote the world. Hello, my friends. Today I want to tell you the story of a man who rose from almost nothing to become the most powerful ruler in Europe, and who fell, in the end, just as dramatically as he had risen. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a short, ambitious, ferociously intelligent man from a small island that most people in Europe had barely heard of. He was not French by birth. He was not wealthy. He was not connected to the great aristocratic families that had dominated European politics for centuries. He had, in the conventional sense, no right whatsoever to the throne of France. And yet, by the time he was 35 years old, he had conquered most of Europe, rewritten the legal systems of a dozen nations, and made the oldest royal families on the continent tremble at the mention of his name. He was a military genius of the very highest order, perhaps the greatest battlefield commander in the history of warfare. He was a brilliant administrator, a master propagandist, and a political operator of extraordinary cunning. He was also vain, ruthless, incapable of accepting limits, and possessed of an ambition so boundless that it ultimately destroyed everything he had built. His story is one of the most extraordinary in all of human history, a story of meteoric rise and catastrophic fall, of a man who genuinely changed the world and who was, in the end, undone by the very qualities that had made him great. So, sit back, relax, and let us travel back to the age of revolution, of cannon fire and imperial eagles, of a world being remade from the ground up, and of the small man from Corsica who stood at the center of it all. Chapter 1. The Island Boy. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the 15th of August, 1769, in the city of Ajaccio, on the island of Corsica, a rugged, mountainous island in the Mediterranean Sea that had, just 1 year before Napoleon's birth, been transferred from the Republic of Genoa to the Kingdom of France. This timing was significant. Had Napoleon been born a year earlier, he would have been a subject of Genoa, a minor Italian state of no particular consequence. Instead, by the accident of political geography and the narrowest of margins, he was born a French citizen. And it was, as a Frenchman, though he would speak French with a strong Corsican accent for the rest of his life, and would be mocked for it throughout his career, that he would make his mark on history. His family, the Bonapartes, as they spelled their name before Napoleon Frenchified it, were minor Corsican nobility. They were not wealthy. His father, Carlo Buonaparte, was a lawyer of modest means who had fought briefly for Corsican independence before pragmatically switching his allegiance to France after the transfer. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, was a woman of iron character, strong-willed, frugal, and utterly unsentimental, who managed a household of 8 surviving children with a discipline that bordered on the military. Napoleon was the second surviving child. He was, by all accounts, a difficult boy, argumentative, combative, intensely competitive, and possessed of a ferocious temper that he struggled to control throughout his life. He fought constantly with his older brother Joseph, who was physically larger but temperamentally much softer, and who would spend much of his adult life being installed on thrones by his younger brother, and then failing to hold them. At the age of 9, Napoleon was sent to France, first to a school at Autumn, where he learned to speak French properly, and then to the military academy at Brienne, where he would spend 5 years training to be a soldier. He was, at Brienne, an outsider in every possible sense, a Corsican among Frenchmen, a scholarship boy among the sons of aristocrats, a child who spoke the language with an accent that his classmates mocked relentlessly. He responded to this outsider status in the way that would define his entire life, by working harder than everyone around him, by being better at things that mattered, and by nursing a fierce, burning pride that transformed humiliation into motivation. He was not popular at Brienne. He was respected and feared. Even as a child, there was something in him that made people keep a certain distance. He excelled at mathematics. He read voraciously, history above all, the lives of the great commanders and rulers of antiquity. He was fascinated by Alexander the Great, by Julius Caesar, by Hannibal, men who had bent the world to their will through a combination of military genius and sheer force of personality. He was, from very early, a student of greatness, studying it the way an athlete studies the technique of champions. He graduated from the École Militaire in Paris in 1785, at the age of 16, completing in 1 year a course that normally took 2 or 3, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the French artillery. He was, at this point, an obscure young officer from a provincial family with no connections and no prospects beyond the slow, grinding ascent through the ranks of a peacetime army. Then the world changed. Chapter 2. The Revolution and the Soldier. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, one of the most dramatic and consequential political upheavals in modern history. The monarchy of Louis XVI collapsed under the weight of financial crisis, social inequality, and Enlightenment ideas about liberty, equality, and the rights of the citizen. The old order, the aristocracy, the church, the absolute monarchy, was swept away with terrifying speed and replaced by something new, something unstable, something that nobody entirely understood or controlled. For most people in France, the revolution was a period of extraordinary danger and uncertainty. For Napoleon Bonaparte, it was an opportunity. The revolution destroyed the old aristocratic officer class that had dominated the French army. Many fled the country, many were guillotined, many simply resigned their commissions rather than serve a revolutionary government they despised. Overnight, the French army had an acute shortage of experienced officers. Promotion, which in the old army had depended almost entirely on birth and connections, now depended on ability and results. For a young man of exceptional talent and 0 aristocratic connections, this was an almost perfect environment. Napoleon's first significant opportunity came in 1793, at the siege of Toulon. Toulon was a major French port that had been seized by royalist rebels and handed over to a British and Spanish fleet. The French revolutionary government needed to retake it, but the siege had been badly managed and was going nowhere. Napoleon, then a 24-year-old captain of artillery, arrived at the siege, immediately identified the critical tactical problem, repositioned the artillery according to his own plan, and within weeks, the port was retaken. The British and Spanish fleet was driven off. Toulon fell. Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general. He was 24 years old. The speed of his rise from this point was breathtaking. He impressed the right people at the right moments. He survived the political turbulence of the revolution, including a brief arrest following the fall of his patron Robespierre, with a combination of luck, political instinct, and the ability to make himself useful to whoever was currently in power. In 1795, he saved the revolutionary government from a royalist uprising in Paris, famously dispersing the mob with what he later described as whiff of grape shot, the rapid fire of artillery into the crowd. It was brutal and effective, and it brought him to the attention of the government's most powerful figures. In 1796, at the age of 26, he was given command of the French army of Italy, a force in poor shape, poorly supplied, and facing a coalition of Austrian and Piedmontese forces that significantly outnumbered it. What Napoleon did with that army over the following year is still studied in military academies around the world. Chapter 3. The Art of War. The Italian campaign of 1796 and 1797 was Napoleon's first full demonstration of the military genius that would make him legendary, and it remains one of the most impressive performances in the history of warfare. He took a demoralized, underfed, under-equipped army and transformed it in weeks through the force of his personality, through inspired leadership, through a series of rapid, aggressive moves that kept his enemies perpetually off balance. He fought a series of battles: Montenotte, Millesimo, Mondovì, Lodi, Arcole, Rivoli, each one a demonstration of the principles that would come to define Napoleonic warfare. Speed above everything, Napoleon moved his armies faster than any commander of his era, marching his troops at a pace that repeatedly caught his enemies unprepared and unable to concentrate their forces. He understood instinctively that in wartime is a weapon, that an enemy who cannot predict where you will strike next, or who is still marching to a battlefield when you have already won it, is an enemy who is already half defeated. Concentration of force at the decisive point. Napoleon was rarely, if ever, stronger than his enemies in total numbers. What he consistently managed to do was concentrate his available strength at a single critical point, to be stronger than the enemy at the place and time that mattered most, even when he was weaker overall. He would often divide his forces to confuse the enemy, then concentrate them rapidly for the decisive blow. The psychological dimension of war. Napoleon understood, more clearly than perhaps any commander before him, that battles are won and lost in the minds of men as much as on the ground. He was a master of morale, both in maintaining his own troops' confidence and in destroying his enemies. He appeared at the front of his troops at critical moments, apparently indifferent to danger. He knew the names of hundreds of his soldiers. He understood that men fight harder for a leader they love than for one they merely obey. By the end of the Italian campaign, Napoleon had defeated Austria, forced a peace treaty, and effectively created a new political reality in northern Italy. He had done it in a little over a year, at the age of 27. France went wild. He was a hero, the most celebrated man in the country. He was also, by this point, developing something that would eventually prove fatal: an absolute conviction that he was not subject to the same limitations as ordinary men, that the rules which governed the possible for others did not apply to him, that his will, sufficiently concentrated and applied, could overcome any obstacle. For a long time, he was right, and that was the problem. Chapter 4. The Emperor. The political situation in France in the late 1790s was chaotic. The revolutionary government, known as the Directory, was corrupt, unpopular, and increasingly ineffective. The country was exhausted by years of war and political instability. It needed order. It needed strong leadership. It needed, many people believed, a man on horseback. Napoleon provided himself. In November 1799, in a coup that the French call the 18th Brumaire, the date in the revolutionary calendar, Napoleon and his allies overthrew the Directory and established a new government called the Consulate. Napoleon was first consul, in theory, one of 3 equal leaders. In practice, from the first day, he was the sole power. He moved immediately to consolidate his position. He negotiated peace with Austria and with Britain, giving France, for the first time in a decade, a respite from the constant warfare of the revolutionary period. He reformed the French administrative system, creating the prefectural system of regional government that still exists in France today. He reformed the tax system. He established the Bank of France. He reorganized the educational system, creating the lycées, secondary schools, that remain the foundation of French education. And he created what is perhaps his most enduring legacy: the Napoleonic Code. The Napoleonic Code, the civil code that Napoleon pushed through in 1804, was a systematic, rational, comprehensive legal system that replaced the chaotic patchwork of feudal laws, regional customs, and royal edicts that had governed France before the Revolution. It established equality before the law, the right to private property, religious tolerance, and the secular nature of the state. It was clear, logical, and accessible in a way that law had rarely been before. The code spread across Europe in Napoleon's wake, adopted, voluntarily or by conquest, in Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, the German states, and eventually across much of the world. The legal systems of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and their former colonies, including the state of Louisiana in the United States and the province of Quebec in Canada, are still based in fundamental ways on the Napoleonic Code. It is arguably the most influential piece of legislation in the history of the modern world. In 1804, Napoleon took the final step. In a ceremony of extraordinary pomp and symbolism at the Cathedral of Notre-Dame in Paris, echoing, deliberately, Charlemagne's coronation 1,000 years earlier, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. He took the crown from Pope Pius VII's hands and placed it on his own head, a gesture of supreme self-assertion, making clear that his power came not from God or the Church, but from himself, from his own will and his own achievement. He was 34 years old. He was the Emperor of France, the master of most of Western Europe, and the most powerful man in the world. Chapter 5. The Grande Armée. At the height of his power, Napoleon commanded the finest military force Europe had ever seen, the Grande Armée, the Great Army, a force of hundreds of thousands of men that combined the revolutionary energy of citizen soldiers fighting for France with the professional discipline and tactical sophistication that Napoleon had developed and refined over a decade of continuous warfare. The Grande Armée was not just a military force, it was a culture, a community of men bound together by shared experience, by the cult of Napoleon himself, by the possibility of promotion based on merit rather than birth, and by the genuine belief that they were participating in something historic. A sergeant in Napoleon's army could become a marshal of France. A common soldier could become a king. Several of Napoleon's marshals ended up on European thrones. This possibility was not merely theoretical. It was real, and it inspired an extraordinary devotion. The peak of Napoleon's military achievement came at the Battle of Austerlitz on the 2nd of December, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation as emperor. Facing a combined Austro-Russian force that significantly outnumbered him, Napoleon executed one of the most brilliant tactical deceptions in military history, deliberately weakening his right flank to invite an enemy attack, then smashing through the weakened enemy center while the attack was underway. The battle lasted less than a day. The Austro-Russian army was shattered. The Holy Roman Empire, the political entity that had existed in Central Europe since Charlemagne, dissolved within months. Austerlitz is still considered the masterpiece of Napoleonic warfare. Military historians study it to this day as a near-perfect example of tactical planning, deception, and execution. Napoleon himself called it his greatest victory. But victory, for Napoleon, was never enough. Each triumph demanded another. Each conquered territory created new frontiers to defend, new enemies to neutralize, new ambitions to pursue. The logic of his position, the logic of an empire built on military glory and personal prestige, required constant expansion. The moment Napoleon stopped winning was the moment his entire edifice became vulnerable, and eventually, inevitably, he stopped winning. Chapter 6. The beginning of the end. The cracks began to appear in 1808, when Napoleon made the catastrophic decision to intervene in Spain. Portugal had been allowing British ships to use its ports in violation of Napoleon's continental system. His attempt to strangle Britain economically by closing all European ports to British trade. Napoleon decided to solve the problem by simply taking over the Iberian Peninsula. He forced the Spanish king to abdicate, installed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, and assumed that, as in Italy and Germany, the population would accept the new arrangement. They did not. The Spanish people rose in a nationwide guerrilla resistance. The word guerrilla, meaning little war, comes from this conflict that tied down hundreds of thousands of French troops for 6 years. The British, under the future Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal and supported the Spanish resistance. Napoleon called it his Spanish ulcer, a wound that never healed, that drained his resources and his manpower steadily and relentlessly, year after year. Then, in 1812, came the decision that destroyed him. His relationship with Tsar Alexander I of Russia had been deteriorating for years. Russia was not enforcing the continental system, allowing British goods to enter through Russian ports. Napoleon decided to force compliance through military pressure, to march into Russia with the largest army he had ever assembled, roughly 600,000 men drawn from across his empire, and compel Alexander to terms. The campaign began in June 1812. It ended in catastrophe. The Russians refused to stand and fight the decisive battle Napoleon needed. They retreated, drawing him deeper and deeper into their vast country, burning everything behind them: crops, villages, supplies, denying the French army the resources it needed to sustain itself. Napoleon reached Moscow in September, expecting Alexander to negotiate. Alexander did not negotiate. Moscow burned, set alight by the Russians themselves rather than surrendered intact. Napoleon waited in the ruins of Moscow for 5 weeks, hoping for a peace offer that never came. Then, with winter approaching and his army starving, he ordered the retreat. What followed was one of the greatest military disasters in history. The Russian winter descended with devastating force. The French army, already weakened by disease and the long campaign, disintegrated in the cold. Men froze to death by the thousands. Horses died. Supply wagons broke down. Cossack cavalry harassed the retreating columns relentlessly. Of the 600,000 men who had entered Russia, perhaps 100,000 returned in any condition to fight. Napoleon had lost an entire army, irreplaceable men, irreplaceable experience, in a single campaign. Europe took note. The coalition of powers that had been fighting Napoleon for years, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, sensed that the moment had come. They united with a determination and a coordination they had never previously managed. And they came for him. Chapter 7. Waterloo. The end, when it came twice. March 1814. The coalition armies entered Paris. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to the island of Elba, off the coast of Italy, a tiny territory over which he was given sovereignty, as if in consolation. It seemed to everyone who observed it like the final chapter. The Bourbon monarchy was restored in France. The old order, which Napoleon had shaken to its foundations, reasserted itself. Napoleon spent 10 months on Elba. Then, in March 1815, he escaped. He landed in the south of France with a small force and marched north toward Paris. The troops sent to stop him joined him instead, regiment after regiment, general after general, rallying to the eagle standards they had followed across Europe. The Bourbon king fled without a fight. In 3 weeks, without a single shot fired against him, Napoleon had retaken France. The 100 Days, the name given to Napoleon's final period of power, ended on the 18th of June, 1815, at a farm called Waterloo, in what is now Belgium. Wellington's Anglo-Allied army held a defensive position on a ridge, while Napoleon attacked throughout the day. The French came close, very close, to breaking through. But Wellington held, pulling his line together with the grim determination that was his particular genius. And in the late afternoon, the Prussian army arrived on Napoleon's flank, fresh and in overwhelming strength. The French army broke. Napoleon fled the battlefield. He abdicated for the second time 4 days later. This time, there was no Elba. The coalition sent him to St. Helena, a tiny, remote island in the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from Europe, surrounded by ocean, guarded by thousands of British soldiers. He would never leave. Chapter 8. The Last Island. Napoleon spent the last 6 years of his life on St. Helena, a man who had commanded armies of hundreds of thousands, who had held the fate of Europe in his hands, reduced to a damp house on a wind-swept island in the middle of the ocean, arguing with the British governor about the size of his allowance and the protocol of his household. He was not broken, or at least he refused to appear broken. He dictated his memoirs, shaped his legend with extraordinary deliberate care, and worked with the same systematic intelligence he had applied to military campaigns and legal codes to control how history would remember him. He presented himself as the heir of the revolution, the man who had consolidated its gains, carried its principles across Europe, and been brought down by the reactionary forces of the old order. This version of his legacy, Napoleon as the champion of liberty and rational governance against feudal tyranny, was enormously influential. It shaped how the 19th century understood him, and it is not entirely wrong. The Napoleonic Code was real. The administrative reforms were real. The destruction of feudal privilege across the territories he conquered was real. But so was the other Napoleon, the one who had reimposed slavery in the French colonies after the Revolution had abolished it, the one who had sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives to his ambition, the one who had told his marshals that he cared nothing for the lives of men because France could produce 1 million soldiers a year. Both Napoleons were real. He was large enough to contain both. He died on the 5th of May, 1821, at the age of 51. The cause was almost certainly stomach cancer, though debate about his death continues. His last words, according to those present, were, "France, the army, Josephine." He was buried on St. Helena. In 1840, his remains were brought back to Paris in a ceremony of extraordinary national emotion and interred beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides, where they remain today, in a tomb so large, so grand, and so dramatically lit that every visitor to Paris who enters it instinctively feels, standing over it, something of the immensity of the man who lies within. Final reflection. My friends, the story of Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the most extraordinary, most argued over, and most endlessly fascinating stories in the history of the modern world. He has been called a hero and a tyrant, a liberator and a conqueror, a genius and a monster. And the remarkable thing is that all of these descriptions contain a measure of truth. He was a man of genuine, towering ability, military, administrative, legal, political, who used that ability in the service of an ambition that ultimately consumed everything around it, including himself. He gave Europe the Napoleonic Code, the modern administrative state, the principle of careers open to talent. He also gave Europe 15 years of almost continuous warfare that killed perhaps 3 to 6 million people. He was a man who rose from nothing, from a minor Corsican family, from an outsider's position, from poverty and mockery and obscurity, to the absolute summit of power, through nothing but his own intelligence, his own will, and his own extraordinary capacity for work. In this sense, his story is one of the most compelling examples of what a human being can achieve when they refuse to accept the limits that circumstance has placed upon them. And he was a man who was ultimately destroyed by the very quality that had made him great, the absolute refusal to accept limits. Because some limits are real. Geography is real. Winter is real. The capacity of human beings to endure occupation and resist oppression is real. The exhaustion of soldiers who have been at war for 15 years is real. Napoleon knew these things intellectually, but he could not feel them, could not incorporate them into his decision-making in the way that a lesser but wiser man might have done. He once said, "Impossible is a word found only in the dictionary of fools." It is a magnificent declaration. It is also, in the end, wrong. There are things that are impossible, and the man who cannot accept this will eventually walk into Russia. But let his story inspire you too. Let it remind you that where you come from does not determine where you can go. That talent and will and disciplined intelligence can carry a person further than birth or privilege or connection. That the world, in its moments of upheaval, opens doors for those who are ready to walk through them. Napoleon walked through every door that history opened for him. He just kept walking long after he should have stopped. Thank you so much for listening. I hope your English has grown stronger today, and I hope this story has stayed with you. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and never stop asking yourself how far your own ambition can take you, and where, perhaps, it should stop.